Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Ukrainian, and in this one we have several developments both in the Kursk region in the northern section of the front line. In the direction of the Serbis river line there's another Russian advance, as well as here to the direction of the north of New York, the western flank of Toretsk, in the Selidova direction, as well as in the Volodar section of the front line, as well as Velika Novosilka. We see that the Russians have made advances in all of these different parts, and there is no Ukrainian advance in this update. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have advanced here north of Lyubimovka. There is some Ukrainian presence remaining within the settlement, and fighting is taking place. The Russians decided to flank the positions of the Ukrainians to prevent an escape, where the Ukrainians could fight towards an exit to fight through Zeleny Shliach or other directions, but now the Russians are flanking their positions along the road to the north and hitting the Ukrainians on the wide front. This means the Battle of Lyubimovka will likely end very soon, as well as Tulsi Luk right next to it. I know I've been saying this for the past 3 days, but it seems that the Ukrainians did not manage to pull out their forces from Lyubimovka. This led to a final stand of the Ukrainians, and this is exactly why the Russians usually leave an exit to allow the Ukrainians to withdraw, not dragging out the fighting. But this time around, the escape has been cut off. There's been no physical means of the Ukrainians escaping, as the Russians hold every single crossing here to the east of Lyubimovka, and this led to an encirclement of the Ukrainian forces, which now is seeing the consequences of with this heavy fighting in the area. To the southeastern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, the Russians have managed to recapture the settlement of Cherkasskaya Konopelka, and with this the Russians are also starting a new front here in the Kursk section of the front line, where they're advancing towards Sutsha from the southern flank. Based on this, we see that in general the Ukrainian positions throughout the Kursk section of the front line are taking massive hits, and with the continuous operations of the Russians on now both flanks, as well as some positional fighting in the northern direction, all of this points towards this being the final battle of the Kursk region for this time, as the Russians are pressing the Ukrainian positions in every single direction. And with these assaults, the Ukrainian positions in the Kursk region are threatened as a whole. The Ukrainians have been pushed out of the Glushkovo district earlier today, and this has allowed the Russians to focus their forces here in the northern parts. At the same time, with the siege on Plekhovo, with the cover of the river line, leaving out an exit for the Ukrainians across difficult terrain will allow the Russians to inflict casualties on a withdrawal from the Ukrainians from Plekhovo, and this is an example of how they sometimes leave out an exit to inflict fire damage instead of sieging the settlement with an encirclement, as we've seen with Lyubimovka. All in all, we see that the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainians in 3 different parts, and it is all pointing towards Sutsha in an attempt where the Russians will be looking to gain full control or regain full control over the Kursk region, and the Ukrainians have only one option to prevent a collapse of this Kursk direction, that is to send reinforcements to this direction to regain a stalemate. However, that is a very risky maneuver for the Ukrainians, because we are already seeing that this positions they're holding in the Kursk region is untenable. They cannot hold it. They haven't dug in properly. The defenses are not holding, and they are exposed out in the open fields in the Kursk region. This Kursk incursion has been very costly for the Ukrainians, and there's really nothing to gain. So the optimal solution would really be to withdraw their forces from the Kursk region before additional forces are encircled, before additional forces are lost in an adventure that really has had no real goal. Moving on to the Serbis river line, we see that the Russians have advanced in the direction of Novosedove. Here the Russians are pushing from the northern and southern flank, the eastern direction of Novosedove, where they've managed to capture some forest lines. The Ukrainians have positions here in the forest lines, and the Russians look to be enveloping their positions by flanking from both directions in a pincer maneuver to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Novosedove, which is a small village The Ukrainian positions near the river line here to the northwest are not really any positions that they're holding on to due to the terrain. It is natural that there's no Ukrainian positions here, as it is just open fields. There's no defensive positions, trenches, or cover from buildings or forests. Therefore, it is likely completely empty. The Russians will look to gain control over the river line here to the northwest by simply leaving it empty and pushing towards Novosadova, which again is a small village, and there's hardly any cover in the settlements. There is a bunch of forest patches. There's hardly any buildings. There's no fortified positions. So in general, we can expect that Novosadova will not hold for much. It is also difficult for the Russians to capture it simply because of how much open fields there is in the area. So it'll likely be the Russians heavily bombarding it to the point that no one can exist within the settlement, which would clear up this area north of Terny, after which the Russians will relocate their forces towards Terny and Yampolivka, which the Russians will look to gain control of, as there's a lot more forest areas, there's a lot more settlements they actually gain control of. That means heavy bombardment on Novosadova, but no real storming of the settlement, unless it is just a small assault group to pick up some positions in the forest areas simply to gain control of it and set up some anti-tank positions within close proximity of the crossing near Ivanivka. So we see that the fighting develops here in the Novosadova direction. The Russian objective is to 200 the Ukrainian positions here in the east of Novosadova. There will be no escape for the Ukrainians to any rear positions. Moving on to the New York direction, the Russians have advanced further towards Sherebinivka, here to the west of Toretsk, as fighting continues on the flank. It's likely that the Russians with this advance are consolidating their gains here by Nelipivka following the Ukrainian withdrawal from the area, and now there's been some positional fighting on the outskirts. It is difficult for the Russians to advance due to the cover fire of the Ukrainian positions in the high ground and fortified positions southwest of Leonidivka, as well as the Ukrainian positions in between the western flank, which is Leonidivka and Sherbinivka, and the eastern flank, which is Toretsk. The Russians will likely look to close this position soon, as they will be looking to connect the two sides, but the Russians have yet to gain control over the outskirts of the micro-district south of Toretsk, as well as the high ground positions by the industrial area. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in the southern flank of Selidova along the railways. As expected, the Russians are making use of the railways to advance towards Vishneve. They are now very close to the road here south of Selidova. It is unlikely that the Ukrainians will be using it for any supplies considering the close proximity, and therefore the Russians will likely continue advancing along it, strengthening its positions with some better flanks here west of the railways, and then push towards Vishneve and the southern flank of Selidova to create a stronger flank on the northern part as well, and thereby cutting off all supplies in and out of Selidova, which we have seen that the Ukrainians continue their efforts to regain full control over the settlement and then pushing the Russians on the flanks. Therefore, we'll likely see some Ukrainian counterattacks on the flanks to regain some of these positions and strengthening Selidova, as well as an attempt to free up the supply lines south of Selidova. However, the Russians do not look like they'll be giving up without a fight. Therefore, we'll likely see some heavy fighting here in the southern flank of Selidova over the coming days. Further south here in the Volodar section of the front line, the Russians have advanced further north along Volodar, both along the western and eastern road. With the eastern advance, the Russians are now secure roads between Volodar through the first coal mine and all the way to the second coal mine. So the battle over the fortified positions north of Volodar will likely commence with a combined assault from the western and eastern road. The western road, the Russians have also advanced further north along the forest lines. The objective of the Russians is to fight over the next fortified line of defensive positions of the Ukrainians, after which it will be battles over the southern flank of Bohyavlenka combined with assaults on the fortified positions east of the settlement. Gaining control of Bohyavlenka will leave just a few fortified positions remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians will look to gain control over Novogreinka as well, and then push onwards in the southern flank of these settlements. Could be also an assault towards Uspinivka, simply to cut the supplies in this direction. Getting control of Trudovo will allow the Russians to have positions in the close proximity of these settlements, allowing them to heavily bombard the roads here in the area, hitting the connection, the bridge, and the general area where the Ukrainians transfer supplies and units in this direction could be heavily bombed by FAB bombs or similar long-range heavy firepower explosive devices. Cutting off that bridge and crossing will limit supplies between the northern and southern parts, and the objective would be to cut off this road. Cutting it off would limit supplies in this direction. With control of Bohivlenka, Novokrainka, and this road cut, the Russians will look to gain control of Maximivka, Yasna Polyana, and Shakhaterske, with recent push here by Solotaniva, further securing the connection between Novodonetsk and Solotaniva. Will then push in a northern direction here as well. They can connect the entire section of the front line, and they'll be able to not just threaten the Ukrainian positions further north, but also in the direction of Velika Novoselka, or in the rear of it by the fortified positions the Ukrainians have in this direction. We see in general that the Russians are advancing on a much wider front now compared to earlier, from the western flank of Velika Novoselka and all the way north to the Kupiansk section of the front line, as well as with a lot of movement in the Kursk region. There's no significant developments in the Kharkiv section of the front line due to the large concentration of the Ukrainian forces who are unable to push the Russians out of the region. And the Russians, due to the high concentration of Ukrainian forces, are unable to make any advances. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.